Hi, I'm indie fantasy author Melinda Kucsera, and in this episode, Catherine Witzaney is joining me to talk about her book, Wingless. So, welcome, Catherine, and let's talk about Wingless. Who is Wingless and why are they wingless?
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Wingless is my debut middle grade fantasy. It's kind of an upper middle grade, so I like to say it's for 10 to 14-year-olds, though technically middle grade is 9 to 12. And who's Wingless? The main character is Wingless. So Asher is his name, and he lives in a world of little sprites who I affectionately call tiny bird riding warrior sprites, because they're kind of like, people are like, well, why didn't you just call them fairies? And I'm like, well, fairies have connotations.
Yeah.
Like pixie dust and Tinkerbell, and they're not like that. they're much more like Vikings or Spartans. So yeah, it is a world where that's all the characters are. The world is big. Like it's a kind of like our world, but they're little. And Asher was born without wings, which it's an element of the story. It kind of gives him a disability because, when it's like being born without legs for a human. So,
wow.
Yeah.
And how does he handle being wingless? That's got to be rough.
Yeah, he's kind of resigned to it. He's scared of heights, though, not surprisingly, because, well, when you live in a society built for people with wings, they're not as considerate about things like, railings and stuff on high structures. And because if you fall, you can just fly, except he can't. So
yeah,
he's got a little bit of angst there. His main goal, though, in the story is trying to save his adoptive sister. And that's kind of what drives him. I'd say it's titled Wingless. It's partly kind of a thematic thing, too, which I guess we can get into a bit later. But
definitely.
It's less of his focus. He's kind of like, well, this is my life. I don't have wings. But
how do you survive in like a society that is geared towards everybody having wings? Does he have to carry around his own ladder?
Well, and I mean, usually, and because the way I've sort of built the world, they do use their legs as much as their wings. And so, there are stairs and ladders and things. There's a particular punishment in the feathered sprite society is actually having your wings clipped. So you can have people that can't fly for periods of time if they've done something bad.
Does clipped means they cut them off, or like they grow back?
In the context, it's kind of like actual birds. Anyone who has pet birds knows some people will actually clip the flight feathers of the wings, and they will grow back, like they molt, and then they can fly again after they grow them back in. I added also as a side note, you can also for a more severe offense, they can be plucked, which would be a lot more painful. But anyway, tangent.
Okay. I mean, that's okay.
That does not come into the story. It's just fun world building tip.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, I guess they get angry when their wings have been clipped.
It's very frustrating and embarrassing for the most part. I would say it's humiliating and it's a pain because it's slower getting around on just your feet when you're used to being able to fly.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
I feel like we should meet the characters. Do you want to say anything else about them before? But I feel like with that introduction, we really need to hear from the characters.
Like, what is this story about? Who are these people? Asher is the main character. He was, as we've discussed, he was born wingless. He lost his parents at a young age in a kind of a tragic incident involving bat sprites, which they're a particular race of sprite. And his mother was a bat sprite. So Asher has kind of developed this really strong distrust for bat sprites now, even though he's kind of part bat sprite. He was adopted by a family of, I call them feather sprites. They're called feathers in the book. That's their race. So of course they have feathered wings, bird wings, whereas bat sprites have bat wings.
Anyway, okay. So they're human esque.
Yes,
with
that is,
just
yeah.
the different wings determines what type of sprite you are.
Exactly. And that is something I do have to clarify to people. I mean, the cover, if you look at the cover, it shows like they're like little humans. They're not like part animal creatures. It's their wing types that determine their race. So they
Well,
don't
what if
have.
you don't have wings? How do they determine your race then?
Well, and that's Asher, right? Well, another aspect to the races is how their magic works.
Okay.
Different races, they call them talents. And the different races draw upon different power sources for their talents. So the feather sprites draw upon the air to sort of fuel their abilities, whereas the bat sprites draw upon the moon to fuel their abilities. So basically, even if you don't have wings,
Gotcha.
that's gonna affect things. So Asher can actually draw from both of those elements for fueling his talent, but that actually he doesn't want to. He doesn't like bat sprites. He tries to avoid using the moon. And so that's part of his arc, part of his journey.
I see. Wow.
Yeah. And so he gets adopted by this feather sprite family, and he's being raised among the feathers. The way this world is set up, the races are pretty separate from one another. They do interact a little bit, but generally the feather sprites stay with the feather sprites, the bat sprites stay with the bat sprites. There's also bee sprites and butterfly sprites and dragonfly sprites.
Oh,
Yeah. So,
that sounds
but
so cute.
yeah, cute is one word for it. The bee sprites aren't very pleasant. Neither are the bat sprites.
Oh no.
They're okay. I shouldn't say that, because the whole point of Asher's journey in this story is discovering that, your race does not determine who you are, and recognizing you can't categorize an entire group of people. Everybody's an individual,
Right.
So
right.
he, that's part of his journey. But
that's an important lesson.
It is, yeah. The stereotype within the story world is that bee sprites and bat sprites are pretty intense, maybe a little savage. So,
wow, savage. Whoa, okay.
Yes,
I was not expecting that.
Yeah. So, in any case, the family that adopts Asher has another adoptive child,
Right.
who is his older sister now, and she has an illness that nobody knows what's causing it. And when the story begins, shortly after the story begins, Asher learns that she only has a fairly short amount of time left to live. They think she only has maybe a month left, and he is determined to save her. So he sets off on a quest to save his sister.
Yeah, as you do, that's
Yes.
that's what we do as siblings.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Especially if you live in a fantasy world,
Right? I mean, it's a requirement of siblinghood in a fantasy world.
It is.
You can't live in one if you're not willing to save your sibling. You have to be an only child then.
Exactly. Oh my goodness. So that's Asher's big motivation through the story. And of course, as he goes, he encounters part of saving his sister requires him to actually go to the bat sprite colony where they live. So that plunges him into this whole world that he's not explored, and puts him in a lot of interesting situations and forces him to grow and make mistakes and learn from them. So,
as you do, as you're in a fantasy, even if you're like an adult in an adult fantasy book, like lessons are part of being in a fantasy world.
It's true.
You can't escape that.
You could argue that all stories to some degree are about learning lessons, but fantasy especially, the lessons are very they can be, the consequences of not learning the lessons, or the things that force you to learn the lessons, are usually very intense things.
Yes, agreed. And and it doesn't matter how old you are. You could be an immortal of thousands of years old. You're going to learn something.
Yeah, ideally. Otherwise, you're not very interesting to follow if you don't have anything left to learn. And yeah, the world's there's a lot for Asher to figure out. The bat sprite colony has a lot of issues, so he's not entirely wrong in some of his thoughts about bat sprites, but he is in some ways, for sure. and he kind of gets pulled into this. It's not an outright civil war, but it's kind of brewing below the surface,
Right.
And he has to kind of pick sides and figure out who to trust and who to help and who not to help. And yeah. So
that's a lot.
There's a lot there.
Person to handle.
It is. But yeah, he ends up I guess the thing that sets him out on his quest is the arrival of a bat sprite at Asher's settlement where he lives. It's not super common to have they call them foreigners coming through. So a bat sprite arrives in company with a butterfly sprite. Now, an element I haven't really mentioned about the world building is the fact that mixed race sprites, they're called halfwings. They're not super common. And like I kind of mentioned at the beginning, they've got the ability to draw from multiple source elements for their abilities, which makes them sort of stronger, except it also means that it's more complicated for them to learn how to use their abilities. And his adoptive sister is also a halfwing. She's part butterfly. And so there's speculation that her illness is because there's been nobody to train her in how to use that side of her magic abilities. The butterfly sprites draw power from the sun. And the feather trainers can't help with that. They don't. It's described in the book like, a fish can't teach a bird how to fly.
Right.
So Asher figures, because her father, who was a butterfly sprite, he went missing before she was born. So she's never had the chance to interact with a butterfly sprite. They're very reclusive. They don't come out that often. Their whole kingdom is hidden. So the fact that there's one that's shown up is a pretty big deal. And he's pretty severely injured, this butterfly sprite that's arrived. So the feather sprites are taking care of him. In any case, the bat sprite that came with him is kind of the one in charge. They're traveling together, and Asher ends up striking a deal with this bat sprite against his better judgment that, this bat sprite has gotten separated from one of their companions who's lost and in the woods somewhere nearby. And if Asher can track this person down for them and reunite them, then the butterfly sprite will help his sister. So that sets Asher off on the start of his journey with a very close older friend of his who goes with him. That would be Hasiel. He's a feather sprite. He's a forest guard. So he's kind of a member of the feather sprite military. And he's what we call green wing, which is a teenager in the sprite world. Asher is... He's probably in human years, he'd be about 12. He's what's called a fledgling. So sprites don't measure years and ages the same way that humans do. So I don't often give precise numerical numbers to ages. They don't even measure time in years like we do. They measure it by seasons. So, I mean, you multiply 12 by 4 and that's how old Asher would be in sprite years. So that would get confusing really fast. But anyway, so they head off on this journey to try to find this missing bat sprite. They are told that she's somewhere in the forest. They got separated from her because they were ambushed by a party of raiders, bee sprites maybe or something. And Hasiel is skeptical of this story that the bat sprite, whose name is Rin, he's a very important character. He remains an important character throughout the story, so that's his name. Hasiel's a little skeptical of this story because various reasons. I mean, raiders wouldn't normally target small groups. They'd target caravans or settlements, things like that. So there's some questions about how truthful Rin is being about everything, and yeah.
Wow. That's quite the... I like that they're called halfwings. That's so cute.
I've had one reader ask me so far, well, what about if two halfwings like have kids And then there's like multiple, like what would you call that? Because then they're like they can draw from like 3 or 4. Yeah. I was like, I haven't come up with a word for that yet. It's not common enough in the world for them to have a specific word for it either. Maybe as it gets more common, they'll come up with a name for that. I don't know.
Yeah, or they just keep with the half wings. They don't see any need to go beyond that.
Yeah, which is also quite possible, right? How do things develop in the real world too, language wise, for different words for things? They tend to just stick with what you initially had a lot of times. But yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what you want to go too far down that path, because that can I could see that like leading into trouble.
That's a whole can of worms I don't feel like opening.
Yeah.
I'm not even trying to. It's interesting because this whole story, I mean, Wingless, when you read it, a lot of the conflict and the character development and everything seems to revolve around the issue of racism. And I didn't actually set out to write a story about that. That was not my goal. That's just sort of how it unfolded in the context of the world that I created. And there it is. I mean, it's an issue. It still needs to be addressed and talked about. But I didn't write it to preach about that topic. It's just how the world naturally unfolded. So.
And I think it's something that's sort of pervasive, unfortunately, in our world of today. So I can see how it snuck in there, even though you didn't mean it to, because it's hard to build a world without it when, there's so much of it, unfortunately, in our world.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because, I mean, obviously this is an ongoing issue and has been an issue for years, but I feel like it's really exploded a lot more in the last 4 years, particularly. And I had already, like, the idea and the world and everything for this book was already written at the time that all of that exploded in a big way. And so I was like, well, this book suddenly became the subject of a very hot button issue.
Yeah.
But I was like, well, it exists. That's the world. It's been created. So we're just going to roll with it. Nobody's been unhappy with it so far. So hopefully I did it justice. But anyway.
I mean, that's the important part, is that that you handle it in a way that's respectful, especially since you're like an outsider to that. It's not something you've seen it, but it's not something you've personally experienced.
No, well, and not in the race side of things, but really the ideas that kind of inspired the story initially when I was younger were actually things like clashes of religions, and even clashes of sub aspects of religions. So the different, Christianity is very, there's lots of different groups within the Christian religion. And so those clashes actually were more of an inspiration to me than actual racial classes and clashes and divisions. But any group of people that is different from another group in some fundamental way there's going to be clashes there on that front, because for whatever reason, that seems to be human nature.
Yeah, it's sad that we are like that, but
it is. It's very sad. But it's interesting to explore in fiction, and I feel like, especially a fantasy world where, if you tried to write a story like Wingless in the real world, I feel like it wouldn't work, because there's too many people have a lot of preconceived ideas and biases and walls that are up, and are very easily triggered by things. Whereas when you remove an issue from its normal setting and place it into a fantasy world, especially a very different fantasy world. I mean, we're not even talking humans. We're talking little tiny people with wings. It removes some of that closeness. So it allows for a deeper, more objective examination of an issue without like all of the, that's immediately triggered by something that's too close to home. It's also something that is great for, kids fiction, kid lit, because, when you're tackling issues like, I mean, Wingless is kind of, struggle of good versus evil, and there's bad things and there's bad people, and that kind of stuff, it can be pretty dark. And if this were, set in the real world, it would probably be too dark for kids. But because it's removed, it's that fantasy world, it creates a safeness, a distance from the subject matter that allows for you to kind of dig into stuff and examine moral dilemmas and things in a way that won't be, scarring to the people reading it.
Yeah. And also gives them, open dialogue for it, because you can do it in a way that's abstracted from our world, but be aware that, okay, this is a thing that really goes on, sadly, in our world. But you can talk about it, and
And my favorite thing is, because I'm not somebody that is really, really strongly in a particular camp on a lot of issues. I tend to see aspects of both sides of things that I'm like, well, I kind of agree with this group on this front, but I agree with that group on that front. I can see where they're both right and they're both wrong. So I really like to examine that sort of thing in stories, which I try to do in Wingless, because the antagonist is a character who is actually a bit sympathetic in some ways. You can kind of see why he's doing what he's doing and actually agree with what he's trying to achieve, but maybe not with his methods of trying to achieve it. So just sort of demonstrating that it's like, okay, yep, there are serious issues that need to be fixed in this society. This person is fighting against them. His methods of the fighting are questionable, though, in themselves. And okay, where's the line? Is there a line we can't cross? And so tis interesting, but it isn't a heavily I think of all of these thematic elements because as the writer, I was very aware of some of it anyway as I was writing. I didn't set out to write a very specific theme. I kind of wrote the story and the theme kind of emerged as I was writing. And at the end, you go, oh, okay, this is what's present in the story. And you kind of refine that and pull it out. But the title, Wingless, as I said at the beginning, his winglessness, it's a physical disability. It's not something that impacts him in a devastating way all the time. It's not the focal point of his character arc per se, but the aspect of being wingless. In a world where, these sprites don't care about skin color. They don't care about, the things we care about as humans when it comes to racial differences. They care about wing types. That's the bat sprites in particular. They're very, even within their own culture, they're extremely fixated on purity of bloodline. And, things like hair color and eye color within the bat culture are a huge thing, because they kind of determine which clan you're from, and they don't want the clans intermixing. Anyway, all of that aside, the idea of being wingless is like, well, you're not immediately from any particular group, even though you are. Obviously, you had parents and they were a particular race and all of that stuff, but it's just kind of it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, it's interesting. And there's also like whimsy too, right? Because they're sprites.
Exactly. And that's where it's, this is not a really heavy, moral, work of like, you have to wade through it and be like, oh man, I feel, this is heavy content and I'm preaching at people. It doesn't come across that way, at least not from what I've heard from people. We're in a fantasy world of little sort of fairies and their struggles and their clashes and their daily lives. Even things like dealing with, massive animals and things like that, and having to survive in a world where you're tiny. So
yeah, which that's got to be terrifying.
Yeah. It is definitely a thing they have to be aware of. The feather sprites, for example, they ride certain types of birds, but there are also certain types of birds like owls that will turn them into lunch. So
oh my God,
they have to be careful.
Yeah. I love that. So they have their own wings, but they also ride on birds.
Yeah. And I got asked about that too in my early stages of brainstorming. Like, well, why would they ride? Well, why do we ride horses? We have legs.
Why do we get on a bus?
Exactly. But it lets you go farther, faster, and you don't tire out. At least not as quickly, right? So,
I would hope not. I mean, yeah. If you do, maybe you need to see some medical professional.
So, in any case, yeah. The world building was super fun. I will say it is a challenge trying to figure out how to write about tiny people and describe things like measurement, distance, height, all this stuff when you're writing about little people that wouldn't use the same terminology that we would. And so how do you show that this person is only 5 inches tall when you can't use inches as a measurement, and coming up with just different ways of naturally weaving that in, because you also don't want to be bluntly like, oh, this person is da 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 da, and that's, because that just pulls you out of the story. we want to enjoy the story and sort of be pulled in. So yeah, it's you have to come up with things like well, it's about this many strides. I rely on strides for distance a fair amount. I'm like, well, if it's that many strides, you can kind of imagine how it would work for humans too. I figure that size-wise comparisons, I'm like an inch would be like the equivalent of a foot for sprites. So like 5 inches tall would be like 5 feet tall. So
that makes sense.
That's what I rolled with. I don't know if it mathematically will pan out right across the board, but I'm like, I'm not a math person. I'm a word person.
Are they really going to get out and measure it though?
No, nobody cares. The main thing is, one of the things that's fun about the different sprites is, of course, some sprites are bigger than others. So within the bat sprites, they've got there's 5 different clans within the bat sprites that all have various physical characteristics, and the clan that Asher is technically from, that his mother was from, is pretty small. They're the white clan. They have white hair. They're very small sprites. And actually, I did base these off of real world bats. The 5 bat clans are inspired by 5 bat species. So, there's the white bats, the red bats, the brown bats, and the spectral bats. Spectral bats are really cool. If you've never looked into bat species, they're massive. They're so big. And
how big are they?
Compared to
ask.
I'm trying to, it's been a while since I did the research, but like a spectral bat, the wingspan is huge. We're talking, I feel like it's a couple feet. I could be wrong. They're massive. They're also very interesting. They're different from, this doesn't come in a big way in book 1, but it is an aspect of bat sprite culture. I had a lot of fun brainstorming bat sprite culture. The majority of bats as a species are polygamous. They don't care about who they mate with or when. That doesn't matter. But the spectral bats are actually monogamous. They will pick a particular partner and they mate for life with that partner. And I found that fascinating when I was reading about bats, because I'm like, why does this one group have this particular, it's neat. So things like that shaped some of how I presented the different clans, like some of the physical attributes and also the behavioral attributes of the, animal worlds of bats.
Yeah.
Kind of inspired some of the world building for the cultural attributes of these sprites. But just sort of a side note.
Wow.
It's kind of fun. I did that with a bunch of technically, I haven't really expanded a lot on all the races. It's mostly the feather sprites and the bat sprites that get a lot of attention in this particular book, because that's kind of the realm that we're in. I mean, the other races come into it a little bit, but they're the 2 most fleshed out at this point. The bats were also...
Yeah. Are they the ones encountered most frequently in the book?
Yeah, there are, for example, he meets another half wing who is half bat, half bee. So, her dad was a hornet, which is a tribe of bee sprite. And so they do come in. There's, and there's the one butterfly sprite character, and the bat sprites in particular. They are a culture that they keep slaves, and they will actually raid the other. They won't keep their own people as slaves, so they will only keep other races as slaves. So there are, when you go to the bat sprite colony, there are other races present. They're not the majority, and they're not living a very good life, unfortunately. But yeah.
Wow. Should we go to the excerpt, or?
Sure, we could definitely do that. You get a sense for what does this world actually feel like?
Yeah, and like how do the characters sound, and like what is the writing like? And I haven't read a middle grade books in a very long time. So
yeah, and I will say,
curious.
I will say this is, it's upper middle grade, so it doesn't read like what you would think of, like it's not like a young kids book. And it was actually originally written to be a young adult novel. In the publishing process, it became a middle grade novel because
how did that happen?
It's really hard to sell a story about little fairies to teenagers.
Oh,
so
because there's no vampire love interest.
Yeah. Now, if you write it about like big human-sized fae and stuff, that's another thing. Teenagers are all over that. But when you're writing a story about little people, I've had a lot of teenagers really enjoy this book, but that's just not the normal thing to snag teenagers' attention. Whereas 9 to 12-year-olds are much more into that. They're like, hey, this is cool. So you don't have to really work to sell it to them.
Yeah.
That's my argument. So it made it so that publishers of like YA weren't really interested in it, but middle grade publishers were. So that's how it wound up being upper middle grade. So we'll see what you think.
Yeah.
So if you're ready, I'll begin here with chapter 1.
I'm gonna mute. Go ahead.
Okay. Asher Songfeather felt a strong kinship with hedgehogs. Firstly, they were nocturnal. They never willingly set out on a journey first thing in the morning, when glistening dewdrops pooled in the clefts of fern leaves or balanced on blades of grass, ready to roll off and soak him in an icy deluge at the slightest jostle. Secondly, they were quiet. They never announced themselves at the top of their lungs with jubilant whistles and boisterous singing, unlike the cacophony of birds in the forest canopy far above, and the 24 feather sprites who made up the caravan of which Asher found himself to be a reluctant member. He'd been given lead line duty this morning, which was easy enough. The hedgehog shuffling beside him through the ferns had no difficulty pulling the wagon it was hitched to. Occasionally, it bumped its wet, quivering nose against his elbow, probably wishing he would release it into the surrounding shrubs to find a place to sleep. But beyond that, it followed the wagon ahead of them without complaint. Asher brushed a hand along the creature's dark side. The hollow quills lay deceptively flat and smooth when the creature was calm, but anyone foolish enough to startle it would be faced with a tight ball of stiff spikes, like the thorns of a cactus plant. It was an ability he sometimes envied. The sound of feathered wings beating the air met his ears, and he glanced back along the column of wagons that stretched behind him through the underbrush. A male sprite had left the cluster of singers at the end of the caravan, and now flew toward Asher above the heads of the walking sprites. With those mottled gray feathers, it had to be Fable. Fable swept down and alighted on the other side of the hedgehog, folding his wings in a single fluid motion. "Good morning, son." His rumbling voice seemed too deep to come from such a thin sprite. He was slender enough to border on twig-like, all elbows and knees and long, nimble fingers, but his creased face could have been chiseled from the side of a tree trunk. Though his wings seemed to dwarf him when spread, when folded, they poked up above his shoulders in a way that made him appear taller than he actually was. Asher nodded to him. "Morning, Fable." "Ah, you're in a speaking mood now." "I'd always be in a speaking mood if you'd wait till the sun was up before waking me." A smile softened the creases of Fable's face, and he laughed. "You'd sleep the day away if I let you." I'd like the chance to try that someday. It sounds marvelous. You'll have plenty of time for rest when we're back from the market. Asher snorted. There was never time for rest during the summer months. He doubted he'd get so much as a free afternoon to himself until the autumn harvest was packed away and they migrated back to the capital for the winter. Is there something you need me for? He asked. It was unusual for Fable to leave the morning song before it was finished. Actually, I wanted to talk with you. Asher glanced at him across the hedgehog's back. Such hesitancy in the older male's voice usually meant he was going to bring up something Asher didn't want to talk about. Fable blew out his cheeks in a sigh. Listen, son. It's been several seasons now since the forest guard refused your application. Have you thought about what other paths might interest you? Asher grimaced and returned his focus to the moss-covered tree roots that rose and fell along the path at uneven intervals. He was already 4 seasons into being a fledgling, the time in a young feather sprite's life when he was supposed to pick a trade to apprentice with, and he still hadn't made a decision. I know you're willing to keep helping us in the shop, Fable plowed on, but my wife and I didn't take you in because we needed an extra pair of hands for the chores. Guilt pricked Asher. He knew that without Fable having to say it. When they'd taken Asher in so many seasons ago, they'd already had a child to call their own, a daughter adopted in infancy. She'd been a fledgling herself when Asher had shown up on their doorstep as a disabled orphan nestling, but they'd taken him in and cared for him like he was their own son. Karnan isn't well enough to take over her old chores yet, Asher said, and you and Isahel can't run things by yourselves. It was a poor excuse. His adoptive sister had been ill for almost as long as Asher had been living with them. And if the forest guard had accepted his application back when he'd first submitted it, he would have immediately moved into the fledgling barracks to begin his apprenticeship, regardless of the lack of helping hands around Fable's shop. Karnan's condition isn't likely to change anytime soon, but we can always hire help if we need it. Fable rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. Great winds. We don't want you to leave, but if you stay with us much longer, you'll have to declare yourself our apprentice. And life as a herbalist? The very thought of such a life path made Asher groan inwardly. It doesn't suit me, he voiced Fable's unspoken thought. Fable gave a hoarse laugh. Don't get me wrong, you've got the mind for it, but I know harvesting herbs and mixing tinctures bores you to death, and we just want you to be happy. Are you sure there isn't another trade that appeals to you more? Asher sighed. I don't know. I've never thought about anything but becoming a guard. It was mostly true. Following in his father's footsteps and becoming a forest guard had always been his goal. Was it unrealistic? Maybe. Passing the advanced flight training was difficult for even the most capable of sprites, but for Asher, it was completely impossible. He'd been born wingless. Before his father had died, he'd used to claim it meant Asher was lucky. After all, winglessness was an incredibly rare condition. Asher had figured his father had a poor understanding of the concept of luck. I know you don't like me saying it, Fable spoke carefully, but you really do take more after your mother than your father. Have you considered... Not this again. She didn't talk about her past. Asher cut him off swiftly. Her only interests were me and my dad. Fable pursed his lips, as if he had more he wanted to say, but knew Asher didn't want to hear it. Unfortunately, he decided to speak his mind. Your mother was a worthy sprite. Asher grimaced. She was a bat. I've heard nothing but good about her from those who knew her. I understand why you feel the way you do about bat sprites, but you can't run from your heritage forever, son. She ran from it. Why shouldn't I? I don't know the reason your mother fled from her homeland, but she never tried to deny who she was. Asher said nothing, and silence fell between them. At last, Fable sighed. I don't mean to push you into anything. You've still got some time left, but will you think on what I said about choosing a different trade? Asher let out a soft breath, relieved to have an end to the topic. He dredged up a smile and a nod, hoping to soothe Fable's troubled mind. His adoptive father had a point, after all. Asher didn't want to end up as a herbalist for the rest of his life. Fable's expression brightened, and he reached over to rub the hedgehog's round ear. Not much farther to the market grounds. It's going to be a wonderful day. Though Asher was glad to see the older sprite cheered up, he couldn't have disagreed more. Gatherers' markets were exceedingly boring, with far more long-winded conversations and haggling than actual exchanges of goods. But he kept that opinion to himself. And that is the end of chapter 1. So it kind of gives you a little intro into the world that Asher lives in. I will say that the feather sprite part of the world has a very different feel to it than the bat sprite part of the world. They're a very welcoming, warm, happy culture. That's not the words I would use to describe the bat sprite culture.
How would you describe it?
Well, I based the bat sprite culture heavily off of ancient Sparta. And so they're very, I don't know if you know a lot about Spartan history, but there was a elite warrior class that was actually the smallest number of people that kind of lorded over the helots. Which were basically they weren't slaves exactly. They were more like really badly abused serfs. And there was a lot of them. And so bat sprite culture is very much that. They're also very, women didn't have a lot of power or authority, but as was the case back then in pretty much all cultures. But so I've kind of, it does.
If you're female, it sucks.
Yeah, I wouldn't have wanted to be a guy back then either, though. I really, their warrior culture, I mean, they took the children from their families at such a young age and started really intensely training them. I mean, you had little kids that were having this really, abusive training to become these intense warriors when they grew up, and not a great scenario. I mean, they're great. They were good fighters. So, bat sprites are, I mean, just even as a culture, I would say they're a little more subdued and serious. They're not quite so warm and fuzzy. And just a bit of a different dynamic. It doesn't mean they're not, they don't have human characteristics. I mean, so did the Spartans, but the overall vibe is a very serious, like, warrior culture kind of vibe. So, yeah.
So, okay. So they're not abusive, but they're not.
Well, I mean, they're not hugging you in the streets. Some of them might be. But yeah, it kind of depends. The bat sprite colony has there's the citizen warrior class, and they're the only ones. They call them citizens because they're the only ones considered to be citizens, is the male warriors that have gone through the martial path, which is the really intense training, and so they are the elite people in the society that kind of run everything. And then there's the denizens, which are basically any men that haven't gone through the training or didn't pass or physically weren't up to it. They're considered part of the denizen class. And then all of the females, all the women, are also part of the denizen class. And then at the bottom of the pecking order, you have what's called the clanless, who are anyone with mixed clan backgrounds. So if your parents were from two different clans, that's actually illegal. You're not allowed to marry or, pair up with someone from another clan in the bat sprite culture. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, though. And so there's actually a fairly large portion of the population that are clanless, and they live in the slums, and they don't have the same rights as everyone else. And they're not slaves outright, because there are outright slaves in the bat culture as well. But they are pretty poorly treated, shall we say, not living in very good conditions. And among them, there's sort of a rebellion brewing. So that's the world that Asher plunges into when he ends up having to go infiltrate the bat colony, because one of the, sort of twists that sets the plot really rolling forward is that not only is his sister dying, but she actually goes missing. And he presumes her to be kidnapped by the bat sprite. And so he goes off to save her. And that's sort of what sets him on that particular journey where he has to go try and get her back. But in any case,
yeah. I'm like, how is he going to get her back when he doesn't have wings and he can't fly?
Yeah, well, there's that. I mean, he goes with his friend, Hasiel comes with him. But the bigger problem they have is that Hasiel can't get into the bat colony because he's clearly a feather sprite. And so he would be a slave. And the fact that he doesn't have a slave collar on him he would get immediately grabbed. And whereas Asher physically is there's a word in the bat sprite culture for sprites that have a mixed heritage but don't look like it, and they call them apparents. So Asher is an apparent. He looks like he is entirely white bat physically. Obviously he's missing wings, and I have it genetically speaking, the feather sprites are kind of matrilineal in that they inherit the wing type of their mother. But Asher didn't get wings. So in any case, that's partly why he looks so much though like his mother. Is the male genes of the feather sprites don't really come across to the young ones as much. And so he just looks like a bat. He doesn't look like he's even a clanless bat. He's got all the characteristics of a white clan bat. And so he can roam once he gets in, he can roam freely in the bat colony without getting harassed by anybody. So that sort of allows him, but means he has to go in by himself. Because his friend can't come in with him. So,
but do they live on the ground? Do they live in the trees?
That is a great question. So it depends on the race. So feather sprites live, they mostly live in the trees. The different settlements, they kind of have an interesting culture where they have a big main capital, which is kind of in the middle of a forest, and it's all built in the tree tops and stuff. And in the wintertime, everybody migrates back to the capital for the winter. But then in the summer, they all go out to these summer settlements, which have a mix of buildings on the ground and buildings in the trees, and they harvest supplies for winter and ship them back to the capital until they migrate back there. And so that's sort of the feather sprite world. They're kind of in the forest and stuff. The bat sprites live in a cave in the mountains. And so and it's a very big cave. And it's very dark, and it's a very different vibe. The only light levels in the bat colony come from the glowing rocks that they use for light. They call them moonstones. They're basically like rechargeable lamps. If you put them out under the sun, or if somebody has a light making ability and shines light on it for long enough, it absorbs the light and then glows. So they use that for light, and obviously fire too. But in the bat sprite colony, there's no trees in a cave, so any wood that's in there would have to be imported from outside the cave. And actually, another aspect of the bat sprites is that they don't let people leave the cave without permission, unless if you're a citizen, if you're one of the warriors, you can go out in your groups. But you have to be authorized. If you're a denizen, you have to receive special authorization to go out, whether you're part of a gathering force or whatever. And you have to go out in the company of the citizens and stuff. And the clanless aren't allowed to leave at all. Doesn't mean they don't leave, but they aren't allowed to leave. So people will live their entire lives in this dark cave and not actually get to go out and see the outdoors, because it's a massive, massive cave. I mean, for us, it would be big, us humans, but they're tiny. So yeah. That kind of is those are the physical settings. You kind of have this lovely, cheery, sunny forest where the feather sprites live, and we have this dark, ominous cave that the bat sprites live in. And it's got its own elements of beauty and interest, but it's just a very different vibe, very different atmosphere.
Yeah, it's wild.
What's funny is that when I was writing this. I've always preferred the feather sprites myself. I would much prefer to live among the feather sprites. I like the sunshine and the forest and all of that and the weather. But for whatever reason, the bat sprites got way more development, and we spend a good chunk of the story in the bat sprite colony. Like that's there. So, and there is book 2. So this is a series. Book 2 is
go on.
It's scheduled to come out next year in June, so it's under contract. I should be getting the next round of edits back on that shortly, actually. And then I'm hoping there will also be a book 3 as well, but it's not under contract yet. So
so this is published with a traditional publisher.
It's a traditional publisher. It's a small traditional publisher though. So I'm kind of like it's kind of like an indie press. I mean they're not. They do a traditional print run, but they're very small and new. And so it's kind of fun.
Who's the printer? Out of curiosity.
It's Chicken Scratch Books is the publisher, and I'm not sure who they use to do the print run, but it is kind of nice. That is one of the big. Well, Chicken Scratch is lovely to work with because they're a small press. They treat their authors really well. I really like the lady that is the editor there, Kiri. She's awesome. She's got such great advice for stories and stuff. But it's really nice actually working with fellow human beings that treat you like a fellow human being and not, the big publishers are not nice to their authors generally.
Yeah.
At least from what I've heard. So, So Chicken Scratch Books, and they publish, they're entirely middle grade. That is their whole focus. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
So that's cool because then they know how to reach those readers. Because a lot of middle grade, I mean, there was the Scholastic Book Fair when I was in school, and that was like the thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a growing group of people that are trying to sort of be competitors to the Scholastic side of things, to offer like alternatives to Scholastic. And I would say Chicken Scratch is probably among those groups. So they tend to target actually homeschooling families, because one of Chicken Scratch's big unique things is they create novel study courses for each book that they publish. And they have 2 different types for each book they publish. And this is something that they're kind of, their focus is homeschooling families, because typically it's homeschooling families that are looking for things like courses for their kids to take. But they also have courses available to small classrooms and things like that for in schools. And so it creates a really neat dynamic. They're trying to become more known. They're getting more known down in the States, which is they're based out of Montana. And they travel all around the States to the different homeschooling conventions and things like that. So you meet people that way. I'm one of they've got like 2, they're going to have a 3rd Canadian author getting published this Christmas, I think. So I'm kind of one of the few up here in Canada, and I'm trying to help them get more known up here because nobody knows who they are up here anyway. But yeah, it's kind of fun.
That's really cool. Like that's so cool that that's just cool. So
it is. Well, it gives you and the funny part is, for me personally, I have an in with the homeschooling community because I was homeschooled. So it makes it great because I'm very familiar with the people. Hey, that's okay. Most of my friends did too. But it just makes it easier because I really understand the dynamics of the community, and it's natural to me to be just reaching out to homeschoolers and hanging out with them and stuff. One real big advantage, and I feel like the book world is starting to see this more, is that homeschoolers tend to be very avid readers. So they read a lot. And so they're actually an ideal target audience to sell books to.
Really?
Yes. Homeschooling families, they read a lot generally. I mean, obviously you're going to find exceptions everywhere, but they tend to be, and there's lots of kids in schools that also read a lot. So not saying they don't, but it's just a convenient sort of target audience to have. It's also easier to, it's easier to like actually make contact too as an author, like to be able to go to like say a homeschooling convention and set up a booth and be like, hey, I have a book, but I also have a novel study course that goes with the book. And oh, by the way, my publisher has all of these things. It gives you more to offer and talk about.
Yeah.
Right.
So what is a novel study course like for a middle grade book? Did you develop it? Did they develop it? Like how, like that's something fascinating that we've definitely not talked about that yet on the podcast. You were the first to have one. So I definitely want to hear more about that because it's something new and different.
Totally. Yeah. It's neat. So I had a little bit. They have the author participate in a small way in the courses. In that I had like to record several videos because the courses are they're online courses, and you go to the Chicken Scratch site and you work your way through them, and it's largely video based with like some written assignments and different things like that. So you actually get to, as part of these courses, meet the author of the book and hear from them about their story. And so obviously I contributed that to it. They have two different levels, I would say, of courses. They have the shorter, less in-depth explore course, which is more like kind of like a book club style, walks kids through like different elements of the story. And in terms of like, testing, I mean, it's the parent or whoever's working with them will like interview them, ask them particular questions, and then the kids will sort of answer those in their own, way. And it's a very fun, it's roughly 4 weeks, they say it would take to go through the Explore course. And the other course is a bit more advanced. I'm trying to remember now what it was called. But anyway, and it's more of a literature analysis course. So it's digging into things like, analyzing the themes and trying to see, well, how is the author communicating different things? Like, what are the techniques that are being used, and things like language and word definitions and all of that. And then it's really neat. There's different assignments that kids can pick from at the end of the course that they can do that are very different. Like some of them you could do an essay if you wanted to, or you could they have ones that are like very like for kinesthetic learners that want to go out and do something physical, like they, creating a game or something that you go out and do. And it's quite interesting, or like art projects or things like that. It's a lot of fun. And they put together the course themselves. They've got like Kiri used to, the lady that is the editor at Chicken Scratch that kind of owns it and runs it. She used to be a school teacher, but she's also involved in homeschooling. And so she's got background in this kind of thing. And she also has another lady who has a background in developing courses and they work together to create these study courses. And then there's the ones you can take the more advanced one, and they have a classroom version of it for a big group that can be taught to a classroom. So it's really neat. It basically fulfills part of your English credits, if you will, when you're trying to include all of that. So it's fun. It was very neat for me as an author seeing somebody create a course out of my book.
Did you take the course just out of like curiosity to see like what it's all about? Like I
passed all my exams.
I hoped you did. That would have been crazy if you didn't.
Yeah, I was curious because they do have quizzes at the end of each module for you to take. But I was pretty impressed, actually. It was neat to see the different things. The neat thing about literature analysis, and anyone who's taken more advanced stuff, like say in university or stuff like that, literature analysis can be fairly subjective. So what one person is drawing out of a book isn't the same as what another person is going to be drawing out. So they kind of give kids the tools to draw things from the book, but they're not necessarily telling you this is what you have to take away from this story. They're just pointing out the different elements and places where, there was foreshadowing here, or, something happened in this scene and it affected Asher in this way. Why did you think he responded in that way? And it encourages like kind of thinking and reading comprehension and all of that. So it was...
Did you learn anything by reading this? Like, wow, I didn't even realize I put that in there. Were there any surprises?
A little bit. Yeah, I would say what I found amusing is just the sort of the way they chose to describe thematic elements and things like that. One of the things Chicken Scratch does is they give like a value topic to each of the books they publish. So you could have something on kindness or something on forgiveness or something on like they've got, and they categorize their books based on these value topics so that parents who are looking for a book about a particular issue or thing can go, oh, this book addresses this. And they picked selflessness for my book, which,
oh, wow.
Yeah. And I was kind of like, oh, okay.
Did not know that was in there.
I was like, it makes sense when I look at the story. I'm like, yep, I could kind of see that. But as the author, I didn't set out to write a book about selflessness. So it's just kind of interesting to see what other people take away from a story that you maybe that wasn't your intent. I'm not upset about it. It's fine. But I definitely was like, oh, okay, cool. I guess that is an element of this story. It's true. It wasn't what I was fixated on, but hey, it's there. So it's pretty cool.
And that's neat.
It really is. It was one of the things where when I was deciding whether or not to sign with Chicken Scratch, I was like, this is so cool. This is like, it was definitely one of the aspects that leaned me towards like signing with them. Because when I decided to, I had still been up until that point trying to push this as a YA novel, a young adult novel.
Right.
And in order to, if I was going to publish with Chicken Scratch, I did have to make some changes because of the conventions of young adult versus middle grade. And, I hadn't written this horribly gritty young adult novel by any stretch, but, there was some of the violence had to be toned back just a little. And things like the romantic subplot that I had for the main character could not really be a thing because it's really just not part of middle grade. You can have subtle things in middle grade for sure, but you don't have full-blown romantic plots in middle grade fiction. That's not the focus. And it probably shouldn't be the focus. That's really more for YA. And so that had to be removed and I had multiple points of view. And you can have multiple points of view in middle grade fiction. Actually, book 2 does have multiple points of view, but book 1 worked better with just one point of view, especially from a middle grade standpoint. Easier to follow. The story's a lot tighter. All those things. So those were the things I had to weigh and be like, okay, am I willing to make these changes? And I decided that, okay, yeah, I think I'm willing to go for it. And now I'm really glad I did. I've rediscovered my love of upper middle grade fiction. It's fun. For people who are like, I haven't read middle grade fiction in like 20 years. I don't know what that constitutes.
That was me when we first started, and that's why I was like excited to have you on, because I was like, we haven't had very many, and I don't know much about it. So
yeah, I would say comparable like comp titles in terms of like age level and content, like the Percy Jackson books, like Percy Jackson and the Olympians series, are a great example of the level of fiction that I'm writing in Wingless. So sort of the upper middle grade, it's still a lot of fun. Like adults can still enjoy it. Teenagers can still enjoy it. But because the upper middle grade you've got complex plots. You're dealing with, weighty issues. It's not being dumbed down for kids. But there are some content restrictions. Like again, like you generally aren't going to have a lot of romance. You can have some like crushes and things like that, but it's not the focus. And yeah, so kind of an interesting. I had forgotten. I actually probably the most fun I had as a reader was in my upper middle grade fiction / lower YA fiction years. I had a lot of books that I really enjoyed at that time, and I was much more a voracious reader when I was younger than I am now. I'm just so busy now. I don't really have time to read nearly as much as I would like. So,
I still do read a lot, but a lot of it is audiobooks.
Audiobooks, yes.
Yeah, because I do a lot of driving, unfortunately.
Yep, that's me. Almost all that my fiction reading is done via audiobook these days, because I am doing other things. It allows me to do chores and drive and whatever while I'm reading. And now that I've gotten in the habit of that, I do struggle to just sit and read a book that is fiction. That's just like, I feel like I need to be doing something while I do this.
Yes. Yes. I have the same problem. Yes. And then I get like eye strain from the screen, and it's like so hard to there's so many books that are not in audio, and I'm like, I want to read them. And
that was actually what made me decide to self-publish the audiobook for Wingless, because Chicken Scratch doesn't do audiobooks yet. And so I retained the audio rights for Wingless, and I was like, well, I need this to be an audiobook because I love audiobooks, and I wound up doing a lot of research and figuring out how to record it myself and edit it myself and all of that and publish it myself. So Wingless exists in audio form because I am an audiobook nerd.
Which is not a bad thing. I tried doing my own, but between working full time and everything, I just found it to be too much work.
It's a lot of work.
Could not find ideal audio recording, situation. So I was having to re-record a lot, some parts 3 times. I was having to do a ton of editing. I kept forgetting what the voices for each character were like, because I'm not a voice actor, and some of my books have I didn't realize how many characters were in there until I was like, well, how do I differentiate this person from that one?
And then you really write yourself into a corner if you write characters that have accents.
Thankfully, mine don't. I've decided, there's only one that would. Yeah.
I removed some of the accents from Wingless when I discovered that, if I have accents, I have to voice the accents. So they're just not going to have accents. Because
I totally feel that.
Yeah, I can't do accents. I can do different voices. It is still something I'm working on keeping consistent. Because I'm not a voice actor either. I had to self-teach on this front. I had the advantage that one of the final rounds of editing that Chicken Scratch has you do is to read your entire book aloud, because it helps you catch things and check for flow and all of that. And so when I did that, just for the fun of it, because I had friends that I knew preferred audio, I was like, I'll just record myself doing this, kind of like a trial run of an audiobook sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I did that just as part of my edit. So I basically recorded my book twice, because I got to play around with different ideas and stuff when I was doing that initial read through, and then figure out what worked and what didn't. And then I went back and actually officially recorded the audiobook after that. So I got to practice and figure out, okay, what do I want my different characters to sound like? And there's still parts where I'm like, I feel like some characters do not stay in a consistent voice, and I need to work on that. But I'll have more practice because book 2 is just around the corner. So
yeah,
it's pretty fun. I would say I love doing audiobooks. I love voicing them. I would do it for fun for other people's books. It's so much fun to me. But I would say for most authors, most authors, though, from what I've heard, regret trying to do it themselves because it's so time consuming and it's not their favorite thing, and it's taken time away from writing other books,
which is our favorite thing.
Yes. I mean, we claim it's our favorite thing, but then we procrastinate it so much, don't we?
I don't, because I guess because I work full time and I do the podcast, there's only I can only write at night. I can't write on, this morning because we are recording the podcast.
Yep.
I usually do one on Friday night as well. So I know Friday night I cannot record a podcast. I have a Patreon, and I promise that I will post 4 chapters a week, and those and which is a chapter every Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So you see where I'm going with this. Friday we do the podcast. Saturday we do the podcast.
So you're very motivated.
Sunday is newsletter. Yeah. So I only have certain blocks of time where I can write. Don't tell New York State or my insurance company, but I was doing the 5-hour course online while doing some editing. I read all the material. I took all the tests, but you have to wait for the counter to time down. And some of the sections, it only took 10 minutes to read the material. So I spent the other 30 minutes, or in one section they give you like an hour, and I was like, there's only 15 minutes of content to read. So I edited for 45 minutes,
yep,
15 minutes, read the stuff,
sense to me.
took the little quiz, and I was like you know.
That makes total sense to me. And actually, I agree with you. I tend to be pretty regimented when I am getting things done. I turn things in early, and I'm pretty focused. But I feel like most of the fellow authors I know, or aspiring authors I know, really struggle to stay consistent and prioritize their writing time. I would say your setup is actually ideal because personally, I get way more done when I have structure in my life aside from having to write, because they say if you want to get something done, ask a busy person, right? And so
Yeah,
objects that are in motion tend to stay in motion. Objects that are at rest tend to stay at rest. So if you are already busy, then I feel like it's actually easier to get writing done in some ways, because you're like, I got to get it done and I've only got this window, so I better darn well do it. However I feel about
it. That's totally it, because like I don't have a lot of patrons. I have just one, and I adore her. And so I make sure that there are chapters every week. And that means, but the benefit of being structured like that is that I know I have to produce at least 4 chapters a week. If a book has, well, the last book had 54 chapters. So I can divide that by 4 and get how many weeks this will take. I just need to get to the point where I know ahead of time how many chapters a book is going to need, because that's not something I seem to be able to predict.
That is a little tough. That was something that took some getting used to, switching to middle grade, because I'm used to longer chapters in YA or adult fiction. Middle grade does tend to have shorter chapter lengths, and so it gives it a very fast feel, because it's like and so learning to divide up my chapters shorter has been a thing as a writer. I mean, it's not a big deal. I will still
doing the Patreon writing though, like I have the show. I started with like 5,000-6,000 word chapters, but now, like if they go over 3,000 words, it feels too long. You know, I find myself writing shorter chapters, and then it means that sometimes they can write an extra chapter or half of the next chapter, and like the plot feels like it moves faster. And sometimes I actually write books faster, because sometimes like you can write more than 4 chapters in a week, despite having only so much time, because they're shorter and the plot is moving. And I don't know, so you can get like a synergy going. I'm not really explaining it well.
I totally agree. I agree. And I mean, even that was kind of my medium, like my general length for a chapter was around 3,000 words prior to switching to middle grade, because that was just what I was used to. Sometimes it would be closer to 4. Rare occasions it would get up to 5, or sometimes it would be down towards 2. With middle grade, I find
drag if you go. I find if you get longer than
really
3.
long. Yeah, and I also, so I'm a plotter. I like story structure and all the things. So I tend to split up my chapters based on scenes. And so, especially now that I'm doing middle grade, you wouldn't have multiple scenes in one chapter. Each you don't want them going super long. Like 1,500 words is like a good length, or shorter. I even have a couple like 500 word chapters in the story in a few different spots, just because that was what worked for that little chunk. And so it's interesting. Like, it does create a faster pace. Also, as a writer, like you were just saying, it kind of makes you feel like you're churning out more and you're accomplishing stuff when you finish a chapter.
Actually.
Exactly. So I kind of like the shorter chapter lengths.
Yeah.
Parents also like the shorter chapter lengths, because they can say one more chapter and it's not like a Brandon Sanderson long chapter.
Yeah.
So there's that.
And I feel like with it being shorter, like, it forces you to like think about what's happening in the chapter, and like not waste words on like a lot of extraneous description and stuff. Like if you're trying to keep it short and keep things moving, you think about the setup. I want to be a plotter. I try to plot, but then like the characters like take the outline, rip it up, burn it, throw it in the ocean,
well,
the ashes in the ocean, and run
there
away
really
with the plot.
there really are two different types of writers, and that, I mean, there's people in between too, but plotters and pantsers. And if you are a pantser and that's just what works for you, that's just the way your brain is wired. So if you try to plot too much, you may sabotage yourself. I just happen to be very much in the other camp. If I don't plot, I sabotage myself. So I am like very hardcore plotter. I have my entire story planned out before I start writing. Otherwise, it won't get finished. So
yeah. I want to plot, because if you can plot it, like knowing that the minimum I'm going to write per week is 4 chapters. So like if I could plot it, then I would know how many chapters are in the book, and I would know when it would be done. So that would make marketing it and everything so much easier, as the current book was not supposed to be 50 something chapters long, but I just wrote chapter 50 this morning. Well, about half of it. And I'm like, it needs to end. It was not supposed to be this long. But they're having a good time. I'm having a good time. And we're just defeating the villain is just going to be a bit more involved than I originally thought.
Oh my goodness. I
have no idea where the characters are going with it right now. That's the danger of it, though, when you don't.
That is
when they won't listen to the plot and they don't listen to you as the author, and you're like, it's gonna be cool. I just have no idea how we're defeating the villain. I hope you characters have some idea, because I'm all out of ideas. What I wanted to do, you didn't want to do, and that would have worked.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's just the joy of being a writer.
Yeah, it is.
I find endings really hard, actually.
Yeah.
I feel like, I mean, beginnings are, in my opinion, the easiest. The first 25% of a story, they're fun. It's a fresh world.
Know everybody. You're looking
and then you
around.
Get into the middle.
Yeah.
The middle is like, everyone complains about the slumpy middle, where you're like, okay, now what? Now what are we gonna do?
The middle is fun and games, and then at some point you're like, okay, we actually have to have this build to something.
Climax. Yeah, we need
run around and do cool stuff for the next 100 pages.
And we need like a thematically pertinent climax. Like I like this is where I admire you doing what you're doing. I would be so stressed. I used to write fan fiction, and in my fan fiction days, I would write a chapter and I'd post it. I'd write a chapter and I'd post it. But these days, I would be very stressed sharing in an official way. Like there are is it Kindle?
Oh, there's I did that, but it was
I would struggle so much because
I put it on Patreon first, so
yes,
and then I put it on there, and then but I couldn't get traction in there like I did on Patreon, so and then the bonuses stopped coming, and I was like, well, I'm not going to do this if I'm not going to get paid for it. It's a lot of effort to post it on there.
See, I'm kind of
scheduling is weird, so you had to.
That would throw me off too. I need to, so I can't post something or share something before I've got the whole thing written and then have gone through and edited it, because I find even though I plot my whole story out in advance, the first draft is still rough. And so I still need to, a lot of times my plotting gets very vague towards the end, where I'm like, well, I know this is going to happen, and hopefully it feels like a good climax when I actually get there and write it. But, once I get the whole thing written and I step back, then I have to go, okay, there are inevitably changes I have to make and areas that need to be strengthened. And I'd be stressing more. It would slow me down as a writer if I was sharing as I went, because I'd be stressing about trying to get each chapter perfect, instead of just being like, well, I'm going to get the whole thing written and it's going to suck, and then I'm going to go back and make it work.
Well, it was hard when I first started doing it, but I've been doing this now for 3 years, maybe more, posting it when I first started, it was very hard. I had to think far ahead and maybe not rigidly plot, but at least be okay, where are you guys going with this? Thankfully, when I started, I was in the middle of like this massive like crossover between two series, and there was a specific point that it had to reach because we reached it in the other book. There could be different stuff going on, like they could be handling the villains and the stuff that the other people in the other series weren't handling. But there was a defined point that it had to get to, and there were certain points where they were in scenes with characters from the other book, and we saw those scenes from the other character's perspective in the other book, so they had to be there. So there was set things that had to happen. There was other things that didn't get handled in the other series that we were supposed to be handling in here, and so trying to get it to all work was an effort and insanity, but I did it. And then I just kind of went from there and was like, we're just going to like have some vague point in the future that we are trying to reach. And as long as every scene is trying to build up to that thing, even if stuff shifts around, as long as we get to that thing, I found that it all will hang together and you don't have to do much editing, but you have to have like that defined, like some idea of where you're going, you know?
Yeah.
The roads, you know, you have to decide, we're going to California, we're going to San Francisco. We will end up in San Francisco. We don't know what we will do there. That is the next book's job. But we must, at the end of this book, be in San Francisco. And as long as you keep heading towards it, everything else will kind of work its way out because you have like a destination.
Yeah, and I can definitely relate to that. Like I plot one book at a time. I don't plot the series because I tend to like stories that are fairly tied up at the end. Like I really don't, as a reader, I have this pet peeve. I hate cliffhanger endings. I'm okay with a lot of suspense at the end still, like a lot of unresolved things. But to have the story end in the middle of the climax with no resolution, and I have read a number of those books in the last year, and it drives me nuts. I'm like, give me resolution of some sort. At least because that's what I read for the resolution at the end. I'm one of those readers where that's where I get all my gratification, is that resolution at the end of the story. And so when that's withheld from me until book 2, I'm like, well, what was the point in book 1?
Yeah, I get that. I like there to be a resolution too. I also like there to be some giant boss fight at the end or some equivalent, some giant climactic something,
some big something. Yeah,
never quite sure what that's going to be, and the characters often surprise me, but that's something and that's why we're in 50 something chapters, because we did have a nice climax, but it wasn't epic enough for me. So
you're like Brandon Sanderson. You're like, no, we got to keep adding on the conflict and the angst and the drama. I find I love Brandon, but I do find some of his climaxes to be so intense and like too much. Like his first book, Elantris, I love, but oh my. I was like, the first time I went through it, I was actually laughing throughout the climax because I was like, how do you keep piling on more stuff? Like, could this can't get any worse? And then it gets worse. I was just like, this is ridiculous. So, I don't, for my own writing, I don't like it to be that intense, but I do like there to be like this nice, solid, like there has to be something big. And I mean, I say this, and I'm also probably a hypocrite because book 2, the big bad thing that happens towards the end of book 2 is really big and bad. And it's like, how can this get worse? It kind of keeps getting worse. So I'm kind of being a bit of a hypocrite here. But anyway, book 1 has a fairly big climax too. So it's very dramatic. It's like, oh no, now what? Now what are we going to do?
But
it's like those black moments.
Yeah, we like read for that though. We want things to get like so horrible that like, you know what I mean? Like we're not reading this for it to be a walk in the park.
Exactly. Well, and I love story structure. I'm kind of a story structure nerd. So the idea that all stories kind of follow the same structure, even though they're all different. And, you know, one of those big structural beats that every story has is the black moment, which is roughly 3/4 through the story. It's kind of around the 75% mark. And that's where all hope is lost. It's the worst possible thing has happened. And now the hero has to somehow bounce back from that. And those are like some of the most hard-hitting scenes in all of fiction are those black moments. But they're also kind of, they make the reader feel things. And then the upward, ideally, unless you're reading a tragedy, the upward climb after the, worst possible thing is it's like, oh, wow. Okay. It makes the climax so much more worth it when you had the really, really negative thing beforehand. And then you end up rising above that. And it's like, yes.
So no, you're right. You're right. You're definitely right. You're definitely right. But like, it's also like the black moment doesn't have to be like some absolute horrible tragic thing. Like I tend to write.
It depends on the story.
Humorous fantasy.
Yeah.
So sometimes totally. It's like, it's not. It's like
I've described it as the black moment, depending on the story you're writing, can be anything from failing a test at school to I messed up and everyone died. Like there's a huge range of black moments.
That's true.
So it really depends. And yeah, in something like a humorous fantasy, you wouldn't want like a Brandon Sanderson style black moment.
No,
that would not be, though I shouldn't just blanket say Brandon Sanderson, because Tress of the Emerald Sea is hilarious. And that's very much like humorous fantasy. And so the black moment there is, while still intense, it's also kind of light still, like because of the humor aspects. So yeah. But anyway, it's a bit of a tangent.
No, but I think it's a good one because it's I mean, every story has to have some kind of structure. Like even authors who hate like story structure, like you can't not use it.
Every story has a beginning and a middle and an end. You can't get away from that.
That's it. Like it's something that's always there. And when authors do it right, and when they don't do it right, you also know. Yeah, exactly. Like intrinsically on a visceral level, when you are reading, when they get it right and when they don't. You may not be able to articulate why that is, but
and inevitably, almost always, problems with pacing stem from some issue with story structure where you're missing some particular element that would kind of boost things and keep it going. So yeah.
No, that's true. So like it's something that you might hate it, but you have to respect it. You can't escape it.
You can't escape it. I'm like, even if you don't necessarily, like, I love using it as a tool for plotting, for brainstorming where to put scene ideas and stuff like that. But even if you don't want to use it for that, I mean, in the editing process, it's great for diagnosing problems. Or if you you've got a problem, okay, it's a great tool for giving you ideas on how to fix the problems. So I'm like, it's don't reject it completely. It's worth it. It's worth it.
Yeah,
it drives me crazy. And you don't have to be you don't have to be super in depth. Like I really love K.M. Weiland. And so I've learned a lot of all my plotting and story structure from her method, which is super detailed. But there are very sparse methods as well of story structure, which are like, I mean, the 3-act structure is about as sparse as you can get. You got Act 1, you got Act 2, and you got Act 3. And you've got particular things that tend to happen the first act sets the story up, and the final act ends the story, and the middle is the heart of the story, right? So, that's story structure at its vaguest. I don't know if that actually helps you a whole lot. Everyone kind of knows that, but you can get in a little more, get into some more nuanced stuff within all the partway through each act. These different things tend to happen and stuff, and that can help. But anyway,
and like the more you like, one thing I have noticed, by like listening, like what helped me was I listened to so many audiobooks. Like it's regardless of genre, it doesn't even matter like what genre of audiobooks looking to, as long as they're like fiction, because nonfiction has a different structure.
Oh, 100%.
Unless it's narrative nonfiction. And then even some narrative nonfiction is not, it's not the same thing. But as long as you're listening to genre fiction, like it doesn't matter like what genre, it doesn't have to even be one you write in. Like you start, because when you're listening to an audiobook, like you can listen to, was it 10,000 words in an hour? Like you can listen to like the whole first act in an hour,
Yeah. Totally.
And in a day, you can hear an entire story and you start to like intuit the structure. I think that's why I was like pants my way through this. I pants my way through a whole trilogy. Not intentionally, I did do some plotting, but the characters completely ignored my plotting. I could have just skipped that and saved the time because they did nothing, absolutely nothing that I plotted actually ended up in the trilogy. But I didn't have to do much editing when I went back and had like I got someone to read it and they didn't like. They were like, "This is great. They're like, this is a really fun story." And I'm like, "God, I pants this my ass off with this." But because I listened to so many audiobooks, like I intuit the structure and I know, like, I kind of know intuitively, like, okay, we're a certain amount of the way through the book now. Like, we are 30 chapters in. If we haven't done this by now, this needs to happen. And if we haven't done this thing by now, then we have a lot more chapters to go, which is probably something I should have realized sooner. But I have 4 main characters, point of view characters, which
that adds difficulty for sure.
Yeah. And that can make it hard to like notice that you didn't hit a certain plot point or that you're on the way to a certain plot point and realize, oh crap, I have like 30 more chapters to go because we've just hit the midpoint, you know, and they all have to have their own kind of journey. You can get very lost in that. I don't recommend pantsing that.
It's hard. I never realized how hard it was to write multiple points of view with full character arcs. Until I wrote book 2. I used to always write with multiple points of view. And then I wrote Wingless and had to reduce it to 1 point of view. And it was like, wow, okay. It made tackling the character arc really easy. And then I decided to write book 2 with 2 points of view and 2 different character arcs that are full arcs unto themselves for each of those characters. And it is a lot more work when you're trying to navigate 2. Because, it just is more complicated.
You don't have to do, like, the main character has to have a full arc in the book. Like, that is,
and
like,
actually,
required.
that is,
but side characters, their arcs can go into other books because, especially if it's like an ongoing series. So I do that with my ongoing series. The side characters' arcs do not have to end in, but the main character has to have some kind of arc in there.
Totally. Well, and that's also an age category thing too. So like in one of the conventions in middle grade fiction is that anyone who has a point of view ideally should have their own full arc. You don't tend to have a lot of alternate points of view that are just like the sort of the brief side character or the complement to the main arc, which older readers are fine with that. We're sometimes annoyed by too many points of view. Hello, Wheel of Time.
I've
read all of it and I love it, but I also hate parts of it. So
I'm not gonna say I've said my opinion on here, but I watched it. I didn't finish Wheel of Time. I threw it against a wall.
You make it
in the middle of book 8, and I've never gone back.
8 to 11 is really weak. 11 is the worst. But the last 3, Brandon Sanderson resurrects it, and it's so good. So it's worth going back to if you can just make it through how bad those books are. But anyway, that's fair. That's fair. But
there's other books. I haven't even read some of Brandon Sanderson's books. So there's a long list of great writers, and I don't feel any need to revisit The Wheel of Time. I got to 8. Fair. It was awful. Between 5 to 8 was awful. And I've heard that beyond that, before Brandon Sanderson, is even worse. I
didn't mind books 5 to 8. I didn't love 8, but I really didn't like 9 through 11. I was so mad at 11. The only thing that got me through it was that I knew Brandon was taking over, and I was like, that was the only thing.
I think I really didn't like a lot of the side characters, and I think that's why I struggled. I liked Rand. I did not like most of the other characters in the book.
I didn't even like Rand.
I did like him at first because he reminded me of a character from another book that I liked. I didn't like him at first, and then he grew on me. I didn't like some of his friends, and I didn't like any of the women.
Point of view gets annoying. Yeah, the women are all very similar to one another. There's one type of woman in that. But anyway, side tangent.
Sorry,
but that's an example of too many points of view. And then in middle grade fiction, it's you can't have, the kids are a lot less forgiving of extraneous points of view than adults are. We are willing to put up with a lot Whereas kids tend to be like, I ain't got time for this. Who's this person?
Right.
Why are they here?
I think as long as you don't do it, Brent, with what's it, Jordan?
Robert Jordan.
Yeah, as long as you keep it tight. Like I have quite a few points of view in the trilogy that I'm finishing, but it's very tight.
Interesting.
Everything they're doing relates to the main plot, and they team up. Like you're seeing things that the other person is seeing that feed into the main problem, and then they get together at some point and stuff the side quests and get all on the same page, and they can trade information and figure out, okay, how do we stop this?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I personally really like stories
on each other, and that can be fun. Yeah,
I like stories with multiple points of view. It's why I was so sad when I had to cut out the multiple points of view from Wingless, even though it is a much stronger story now with just the one. It forced me to write better in that one point of view because I had to.
How did you get picked up with the publisher? Did you query them, or did they come to you? Like, how did that?
So I had a very interesting process of querying. It took me about 8 months to get in with Chicken Scratch, but I got over 100 rejections in that period of time.
Wow.
Because I was querying like a fiend. I was trying to get agent for the first chunk of time. Like that was my main focus. And there's a lot of agents out there. I did also query some small publishers because I knew, but I kind of knew what I wanted. I didn't want to get in with a small publisher that didn't do a print run of some sort, because in my mind, at least for me, I'm like, if they're going to use print on demand, I may as well just self-publish, because I can use print on demand and then I don't have to share the royalties with anyone. So that was kind of my perspective going into it. I only wanted small publishers that were going to do that, because I can't do a print run. I can't finance that or store all the books or but I queried a ton of agents and some small presses, and mostly was getting back that they liked my writing, but the story wasn't what they were looking for. And it's because I was presenting it as a YA story, and they all kind of instinctively grasped that this would be tough to sell in that category, even though, I mean, I know lots of teenagers that enjoy it, but again, it's just the broad marketing side of things is not the easiest thing to market to that age group. So eventually what happened was one of these small presses that I submitted to got back to me and said, with actually a very lovely detailed response. It's like, you don't get that very often. Normally you get form rejections or nothing at all. And this editor had taken the time to say, like, I really like this story, but I think it would fit really well in the middle grade realm. We don't publish middle grade, but there's this other publisher that does, that I think would probably like it. Why don't you try submitting to them? And that was Chicken Scratch. So I did that. I reached out and I contacted them and explained that I'd gotten this referral. An industry referral helps if you've been referred by another publisher or another author, or not an author, but like an agent or someone. It helps the publisher you're going to know to take you a little more seriously. And anyway, they liked it. So they were like, as long as you're willing to make these changes, we're willing to take you on. And so I was like, okay. That was how I ended up getting on with Chicken Scratch. So,
and so they published Wingless initially.
Yes. So I didn't sign a series with them. Okay. I wrote Wingless with knowing I wanted it to be a series, but I also wrote it so that it could be a standalone, because again, it's a little harder to get published as a new author if you're leading with a series, because the publisher's taking a chance on you. They're like, is this going to sell? Is this going to do well? If book one doesn't do well, the other two books aren't either. So I kind of wrote Wingless it can work as a standalone, and it functions perfectly fine as that, but it also continues on. The story continues. So I am now, like I said, I'm now under contract for book 2. So that is for sure coming out in June 2025. And then I do have plans. I'm planning book 3, and I hope once I write book 3 to then have that under contract as well. But we'll see how things go. I'm also having a baby this June, so that's that's going to keep me busy. We'll Definitely. See how much time I have.
Well, you may end up getting more written, because you'll have, you know what I mean? Like, you'll have less time to do it in, so you'll have to be very focused.
Yes.
And like you don't know, like it can go either way.
I could.
That sort of thing.
I do follow enough authors that have a whole bunch of young kids, and that to be assured that it is still possible to be an author and write with young children. It just means that you have to prioritize things a little differently and organize your time differently.
Yes. But it is doable. It's not a death knell for the publishing career.
No.
So do you write the sequel and then you pitch it to Chicken Scratch, or how does that work when you don't have the sequels under contract with them?
Yeah, that's how it worked for this one. And part of why Chicken Scratch is still a pretty new publisher. They just started up in 2020. It depends on the publisher. With them, what I did is I had a meeting with Kiri where I pitched the idea to her and I said, "This is what I'm wanting to do. What do you think?" And she said that it sounded good. She gave me some suggestions, but she wasn't going to sign me for the idea until I had actually written it so she could actually see what she was getting into. And then when I did, it is a risk. You, as an author, you're taking a risk. Well, if you're spending the time to write the story, and then what if they don't want it? Right. But I figured I didn't feel like it was that risky because I knew that she really liked book one. And so I was like pretty confident, and she was wanting to get into doing series. I think I'm her first series that she's doing. There's other authors that she's working with that are also now doing a series, but I'm the first one that's coming out as a series, I think. So I knew she wanted that. So there wasn't as much of a risk.
I see.
Yeah. And then with book 3, I just haven't sat down and talked to her about that yet. I suspect it'll probably be the same idea. I don't even know, like, you can like work with publishers where you like pitch the idea and they sign you for the idea, and then you write it. I feel like that'd be a lot of pressure. Also, usually the motivation for that is bigger publishers do advances. So once you get signed, you get paid something. Chicken Scratch does not do advances. As a small publisher, not all small publishers do advances, and so they don't. It does mean that you don't have to earn back your advance before you start getting royalties, which is kind of nice.
That's good, because if you sell quite a bit, you immediately get royalties. I mean, not immediate, because like the publisher doesn't get paid immediately from the
exactly, and I think
they get paid.
I think it's like quarterly. Yeah, something like that. But it does mean that I will actually see income immediately as things are selling. But it also means that I only get whatever I sell. I don't get like an initial chunk of money up front. But I'm okay with that because I'm not writing to support myself. I teach piano to do that.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm really married, so my husband works too. But yeah, I definitely am not. I am an author because it is my passion, not because I need it to pay the bills, which is good because wouldn't pay very many bills at this point. But that's okay. I'm pretty early innings.
Yeah, my books don't pay the bills either. But there have been months where like I did pay bills with them. Because there was like spike in, I did something incredibly right and got in front of the right people, and sales were really good and definitely helped me out of some tight financial places. So I'm deeply grateful for those readers purchasing those books. I was very in debt for a very long time. I'm still in debt, but not to the same degree where I'm like, okay, how are we buying groceries? How are we getting gas?
Yeah.
I don't have 2 incomes. It's just me. So
that's fair. That makes it harder.
Yeah. But it's also fun. I have to say, I wouldn't do it if it wasn't so fun.
That's where some people go into authoring and writing because they want it to be their career, where they're like, I want to be able to quit my job and write books and support myself writing books.
I think that would be terrifying.
I don't want to do that.
That would be terrifying because you would sink or swim.
All the joy out of it.
Yeah, you would sink or swim on my next series. There's been a lot of interest, so like that would be good. But I've had other series where there wasn't, where I would have been in financial difficulties.
Yep.
And it hasn't come out yet, the new series, so I don't, just because there's a lot of people following it and there's interest is not dollars.
Yeah, that is true. That is very true.
With interest.
You never know, right? Wouldn't that be nice? You just never know. And that's where like I want to write because I want to create awesome stories that people can read and enjoy and shape them as people, and I can enjoy doing it. I don't want to turn that into a grueling thing I have to do to feed myself. So.
Yeah, no, definitely. But that's really interesting what you said about pitching an idea, because like the current thing I'm working on was this wild idea that I had. Like it's very high concept epic fantasy, but but in humorous. Like if I wrote it not as a humorous story, it would have been like very dark and depressing, but we did it with humor, and so it's just a lot of fun. But like something like that might have had a good home with a publisher, but I didn't think of it at the time. I just wrote the darn thing.
Well, and usually in order for publishers to be willing to do that, you have to have already published one, like at least some other book with them before they're willing to like just, unless you're already like a known entity, like you're famous with some other publisher and you're switching publishers, they generally won't sign an unknown person for an idea. They want to see the finished work first. And then once they know you can produce, then they might start signing you for ideas. I see the stress that it puts on authors when they're under contract for an idea that hasn't been written yet. And I'm like, that just sounds like a lot of pressure. I mean, I'm sure I'll do it at some point, but oh man, it just sounds like a lot of pressure.
But like, I do really well with pressure. Like, that's why I put the current one that I'm working on. I put the pre-launch for Kickstarter up like basically like last year, at the end of last year, when I was first started the trilogy, and it's been just a huge chunk of my life since then. But like it was just an idea, and I didn't even know like exactly like how it's gonna go, and so I've been just refining the marketing language about it, like about what this thing is, as this thing has taken shape, as book 1 was written and then book 2 was written, and now I'm toward the end of book 3. I'm like, okay, now it has a defined shape. There's definitely the characters were right. What they wanted to do was much better than what I was going to have them do.
Well, that's good. That is a good discovery overall.
Yeah. But like I went from like an idea to like a whole, almost an entire trilogy. Like I have like it's over 150 chapters I've written already for it across 3 books. And like it was just an idea that I had. Like, what if some rogue gods just decided to mess around with the timeline? Like what would happen?
Well, and
where would that go? What would that look like?
If you've got a really like high concept idea that is really meaty like that can work, it's like it's so much easier to write that than something that's maybe less grabby, less easy to work with, right? But
I think so, yeah. But like it's just interesting that I didn't know that. I mean, I don't have a relationship with traditional publishers in any way, but it's interesting to know that if I were to have that sort of thing, that like I could have like gone like I'm in a different universe, who had gone down the traditional publishing path, could have pitched this idea and then wrote it, and that could have been like, I wonder now like what would have happened with that. But I chose to do it, to continue on the path that I'm on, which is self-publishing. I have no regrets about it. I have
and that's
car payments with that.
I was gonna say, you do sacrifice, like when you are doing traditional publishing, you're not making nearly as much off of what you write, right? Because the royalties, whatever you get for royalties, I mean, Chicken Scratch has very generous royalties, but most publishers don't. So, it just, you're not making as much off of it. For me, the thing that sort of made me want to do the traditional publishing was the fact that it's like, well, it comes with built-in professionals and you don't have to finance it all yourself.
Well, that's it. That's it. I just learned to do a lot of it myself. And then it's. Always,
I kind of wanted, I like,
because then you can upgrade, as self-publishing, because
true.
You are getting all of the royalties. You do your absolute best effort, and then if you put out in the marketplace and find out, okay, my best is not good enough, but I've made some money, and now I have some idea of what the best is, what this needs now. Like usually it's a different cover. You know, you can go out and now you're armed with that information and you can get that. You've got some royalties and you can just keep making things better, which I think is like awesome. You can box it up. You can do like amazing things when you're
you can do a lot of really cool stuff, and you also have more access to things like live marketing data when you are indie publishing, so you can really see when you do something, did it move the needle at all on sales? Like you can see what works and what doesn't work. With the path that I went down, now if you are with a publisher that mainly goes to Amazon for pushes sales to Amazon, then you do kind of have access to that because you can access your author panel there on Amazon. My publisher doesn't do that though. They like to push sales direct to Chicken Scratch because you make a whole lot more because they do their own print run and stuff. It makes more sense, and the community we're marketing to tends to not like Amazon anyway, so it works, but it also means I don't have access to a lot of live marketing data. I've got to wait until the quarterly report to see, well, how are things going on the sales front? Like Wingless launched April 1st this year, and I think it's done pretty well, but I don't know how many books I've sold. I know how many books I've sold in person, right? Like I know the in-person events. I know what does show up through Amazon, which is pretty minor because most people are not being pushed to Amazon. But I don't know how many books they've sold from bookstores. Like I'm in some local bookstores, and you can order me online through Barnes and Noble and stuff. But then there's also direct sales from Chicken Scratch and all of that. I don't have access to those numbers. I just assume they're happening. So we'll see. Yeah,
that's interesting. That's really interesting. That's a good counterpoint. So you get access to professionals but you don't have the marketing data. That's really interesting.
You don't I would have more marketing data if I was working with a publisher that did push to Amazon in a big way. And a lot of publishers do because Amazon is huge and a lot of sales happen through Amazon. It's just that Amazon is not very nice to authors either.
No.
They don't exactly, you make pennies off of what you sell through Amazon. So it's not ideal financially, but it does give you access to live data because you can see, it tells you like, well, what have you sold and when?
And if you're not in Kindle Unlimited, you make fractions of a penny for a page. If you're not in Kindle Unlimited and you put your books on, you don't get, you get like less royalties. Amazon keeps more. It's not good.
Yeah, it's true. I only had to experience a little bit of that because, well, I mean, not only do you make pennies, but then when you're signed with a traditional publisher, I only make like a percentage of the pennies.
That's true. Right? That's true. So there's that. Yeah.
I did self-publish the audiobook, and I decided to do non-exclusive with ACX, which is the Audible publishing.
And that means you get 20%,
like way less, right? But I wanted to be able to go with Findaway Voices because that's the other distributor that distributes broadly to all the different audiobook distributors, and because I wanted to be able to get into libraries with the audiobook potentially. And stuff. I don't know moving forward if I would do that because I've actually gotten some sales through Audible. I don't think I've gotten any sales through any of the Findaway Voices distributors. So I'm kind of like, I mean, it didn't cost me much to make the book, so I'm not worried about it because I made it myself and I narrated it myself. So I'm not too worried about, producing tons of sales, but I'm kind of like, well, in the future, should I just sign with ACX? Like, I don't know. But they've got weird things where it's like, if you do sign exclusive, you have to be with them for 7 years. And I'm just like, I don't like that. Like, don't try to rope me in.
Yeah. And with only one book, it's hard to know if the reason you don't have the library things is because there's only one, Yeah. And
it's still, audiobooks are harder to get into libraries. I know I've got my physical book in libraries because people have requested it there. But Yeah, it's I'm just not too worried. The audiobook is something I did for fun for myself, and I'm like, if it has some sales, great. It didn't cost me much. I enjoyed making it. But yeah, I will say, if you want your book in physical stores, like for example, Barnes and Nobles up here, it's Chapters Indigo is basically the Barnes and Nobles. If you are indie, it is much harder because you can only get into stores on consignment, which means you have to literally go to each physical store and have your books there. Whereas if you go through a traditional publisher, you can get your book available in the online catalog so that people can order it from any store in the country. And yeah, and the way it was set up for us, we actually have some books at the local bookstore in town, like the 2 towns closest to where I'm living, basically. So it's like, okay, it's kind of neat. I don't know if
you can, as an indie, get into Barnes and Noble because all you have to do is be published by Ingram. But there's different. But just because your book is in Ingram does not mean that Barnes and Noble will pick it up. There's like a whole host of things that you have to do so that your book is in Ingram, like the traditional publishers. You have to have the discount that they want. You have to have allow returns,
which is dangerous.
Yes, it can be very costly to have that. You also have to have like some kind of publishing name, and like you have to be set up basically in Ingram so that you look like you're published by a publishing house. And then there's a few other steps to it, as an author was telling me about them, because she got her books into some Barnes and Nobles near her. And she did it because she wanted to do readings there, and she wanted them to be able to buy the books for the readings, so she didn't have to lug them, so that's what she did, because she does a lot of events and she does a lot of in-person things, and that meant more to her than making good sales on Amazon. It's that's the way it goes. I really like online sales. Yeah.
It's fun. Like the problem with in-person events is you need the time and the resources to do them and set them up and be there. I've really enjoyed the ones I've done so far, because it's fun getting to meet people and talk to them and that kind of thing. I'm not an extrovert, but I do like to talk to people. I don't know if most authors aren't. I feel like we tend to be introverts. But I like talking to people and seeing them in person and signing books. I had a book signing last weekend at a Chapters store, and it was like, oh, it was fun. It was a good way to sell books in person. So yeah.
I'm going to do my first in-person event this coming Friday. It's an author event, and then there's like a signing in the last 15 minutes. So I've not done any like events. So I'm like very much not a social person. Also, I work a lot. So like getting time to go to places is not easy. And it's expensive to like travel to things. This happens to be like in like the New York metro area, which is where I live. So like I have 2 options to get there: public transportation or driving. So
makes sense. I'd say good luck. I think you'll probably enjoy it. They're not for everybody. Not everybody likes live events, but I think they're quite a bit of fun.
It's a panel. Yeah, it's a panel discussion, and then there's like a
that should be interesting. Yeah.
My allergies are making my eye tear.
Oh, it's all good.
Itch and tear. I took like 2 allergy medicines, but clearly they're not working. As my eye is just like leaking like tears. It doesn't tear when it's dry, but like every once in a while the allergies will hit it just right, and it just like turn on the water. I was like, why can't you do this all the time? Like not to this extreme, but like a little bit all of the time, so they don't need to spend money on these expensive drops. But
oh man.
So don't mind me. It's definitely it's allergies. You said you're finished book 2, or you're working on book 2?
Book 2 it's finished. It's in edits right now. So I submitted like the first round of edits is done. So that was like I wrote the first draft. I did a little bit of polishing, and then I sent it to my editor, and then she went in and creates kind of a vision letter of like where she goes, okay, this is what's working. This is what I think isn't working. Can you make these changes, these overall bigger-ish changes? Like I had to cut out a character completely and change a couple things. Like my one character arc wasn't working, so I had to fix that. And but those are like the developmental edits, the big picture ones where you're rewriting whole scenes or writing new scenes and putting them in. So I did that, sent it back to her, and I'm anticipating within the next week or two that she's going to be getting the next round of edits back to me, which is not huge, massive global changes. It's just like going line by line and like, tweaking things and clarity and all of that stuff. And there might be a few, like, depending on how she likes the changes that I did make, she might have some thoughts on how those could be improved more. So I might have to do a little bit more writing, but it's less work once you get to this stage. And then there'll be a few more exchanges where it's just basically polishing and catching typos and making sure that it's the best quality writing it can be. But the story itself is done. I made sure that I had finished the first draft before Wingless launched, because I have seen other authors struggle with, once they have a book published, they find writing the next book harder because suddenly they have reader expectations looming over them, and it's pressure where you're like, oh, readers really liked book 1. What if I can't do it again for book 2? Like right. That kind of, like, can I do pressure? It again?
Yeah.
Right. So we'll see. I'll get to experience that with book 3, because book 3 right now is still in the brainstorming stage where I haven't even outlined it yet. But I do want it to be a thing. I want it to be a trilogy that kind of wraps up. And
okay. Do you have any plans on what you want to write after the trilogy? You gonna stay in middle grade? Yeah. You're gonna, like, what are you thinking?
So right now I do have plans for a prequel duology I want to write in the same world as Wingless. So that would obviously be middle grade. But I'm currently working on outlining / brainstorming a idea for a sort of, I don't know if it's YA or new adult fantasy set in a totally different world, obviously, that has like sort of a very strong Irish vibes. Like it's kind of almost like I want to set it in an alternate Ireland of sorts.
Okay.
Like early medieval Ireland. And it's not going to be in the real world, but like it'll be heavily, like everyone will know this is basically just an alternate Ireland kind of thing. So I'm playing around with that and like the Fae and it's fantasy still. Mm-hmm. So that's still in the early stages, but I would really love to get that outline finished within the next month or so, and then maybe have a first draft written by next summer that I could start pitching to publishers, because I can't publish that with Chicken Scratch because they only do middle grade. I don't want to only write middle grade. I do want to write for older readers as well, because there are some things I would like to explore in my stories that I cannot explore in the realm of middle grade. So that is my next, the idea that's currently on the go. And I have a few other ideas kicking around in the back of my brain. I have an idea for like a sci-fi, even though I don't even particularly read a lot of sci-fi and I've never written sci-fi. For some reason, I have a sci-fi idea back there. So someday.
Yeah, I have a few of those, but I've only so far written and published epic fantasy. I've got quite a few out there.
Fantasy is my favorite, honestly. So I don't know where the sci-fi idea came from, but it's there. We'll see if it turns into anything.
I know where mine came from. I listened to a lot of sci-fi books.
That would do it. That would do it. So that's my future plans for the time being. We'll see how much having a new baby in the mix affects productivity and all of that stuff. But yeah.
Well, like for the first 6 months, like they're not gonna do very much except eat, sleep, and
interrupt my sleep. I was gonna say the main thing I'm like is I know the level of sleep deprivation for the first while could be pretty intense, and I haven't done a lot of creative work while horribly sleep deprived, so that should be interesting. But the newborn phase, they sleep a lot, so
yes,
in theory, I will have time to do things. If I have any brain power.
Not my nephew. He did not sleep a lot, but he was late. He was a big baby. He was like almost 10 pounds, I think it was.
That's a big baby.
He was a newborn technically, but he was like at the 99th percentile of everything because he cooked longer versus his sister, who was just born the day before my birthday. And she's she does sleep a lot because she was born early because my sister-in-law was having some medical issues, and so they had to the baby had to come out. So she was undercooked.
Yes.
So she just sleep and eat and went to the bathroom, and that was it for like a while. But my nephew did not do that. They were very upset, my brother and his wife, when he came along, because they're expecting newborns to sleep and eat, and he wanted to be entertained. He was already like, he was a big baby. He was much more developed. So it all depends. So I don't know. Those are the only two babies that I have any experience with. I adore them both.
I feel like it really depends on the kid because my close friend has two little ones.
And how much they're developed, I think, too.
Yeah, hers were both born. Well, the first one was born pretty near the due date, and she's always been a terrible sleeper. Terrible sleeper.
That's my
second
nephew.
one was actually pretty premature. I think she was born around 32 weeks, and she has been a fantastic sleeper, for at least for now. So, but I think it mostly just depends on the kid and the luck of the draw, and
Yeah. So we'll hope that you draw the child who needs more sleep, so that you have some time, and you don't get the one that cooks too long that is beyond the sleeping stage. That's like, mommy, entertain me.
Let's hope it doesn't cook too long, because that means the baby's in the belly that much longer, and I'm already feeling stretched. So,
oh no.
I'm like, whew, let's hope this kid comes when she's supposed to.
Yeah, my sister-in-law said, she was like, can't we take the baby out now? I'm done. I've had enough. Where's the exit clause?
Yep. Oh boy. So we'll see. But then, even if I have an easy first kid, then you get the hard second kid. It seems to be inevitably, if your first kid's really tough, the second kid tends to be easier. If your first kid is an easy kid, your second kid tends to be harder. That just seems to be what I've seen in my extended family and my in-laws and all of that.
It seems to be the pattern. That was the pattern my mom said with me and my siblings. I was the difficult one. My two siblings were much easier because they came after. And my nephew was very difficult, and his sister, so far, she was born March 9th, 2024. So we don't have a lot of life yet to judge by. But so far, she's been very easy, they said.
That's good. That's funny.
So
yep. Well, we'll see what happens. It'll be an exciting summer.
They need an easier one because my nephew is 5.
Oh, and he's a boy.
Yes.
So there's the I mean, not all boy children, but all the boy children I personally know are very rough and tumble, and
he is, but he's also like very caring, and he's just a wonderful kid. Very bright, very articulate, loves to cheat at board games, so I cheat back, and we have a good time.
Oh my goodness!
He doesn't even care because he knows he's cheating, and he's not even like trying. He's not even pretending that he's not cheating. So we just make up our own game rules to the game, and it's just a lot of fun.
That sounds like a blast.
He is a blast. Yeah. So anything else you want to say about Wingless or any of the many other things that we have touched on?
We've had quite the conversation.
Seriously.
Yeah, totally. I feel like we pretty much covered everything. I do feel like at the start I led very strong with like the thematic elements of the story. It's honestly, it's just a fun fantasy story. Like I said, it's not preachy. Those things are on my mind now that I've written it and I'm thinking about it, and I'm like,
and you took the course.
I took the course on my own book.
You're like, what's the theme? Wondering.
Exactly. So, I think about that as the author, but I don't, the people that are reading it are just like enjoying the fact that it's like, wow, this is really fun. These characters feel really real. The world building is vibrant, et cetera, et cetera. They're enjoying the story. They're not going, wow, that was a very moralizing kind of thing. And I feel very educated now on this particular moral subject.
Are you going to keep the same theme across all of the books, or are there going to be different themes?
It's so book 2 has kind of like delved into some more of the same for at least one of the characters, because she's kind of on her own arc that has some similarities to Asher's, but There will probably always be elements of like the racial clash because that's just part of the world. Like it's just built into the world. But I would say like book 2 on the thematic front, like Asher is on a very different journey in book 2, and he's exploring things like self-forgiveness and that kind of stuff. So it definitely it explores other things too. So I don't set out to write a specific theme usually. I kind of knew going into book 2 because of where my main character was at. I was like, well, I kind of knew what I wanted him to explore, but I doesn't, until I've written the story, I didn't really know how to do that. Like his arc was not working. The other character, Siobhan, who has a point of view, her arc worked great. And I hardly had to do anything to like tweak it. For whatever reason, but Asher's was not working. So it's now working better. And now that we've edited it, it's now working, I think. But it sometimes takes me writing it to actually know, what am I trying to say? Do I know what I'm trying to say? What's here? What is the character trying to say or figure out? So book 3, no idea. We'll see as I start to brainstorm what that's going to look like. I want to ideally in book 3 kind of tie up the arcs of the major characters, because like the antagonist from book 1 is still a really important player in book 2, and then by the time book 3 rolls around, he's got to have his arc kind of tied up, even though he hasn't been a viewpoint character, but he stays important. And so I'm kind of like, I know I've got a few characters that I really want to tie things up in a way that feels really resonant and like, yes, this fits for book 3. But do I know how to do that yet? No, I do not. So we'll see what happens.
That's why we write, to discover what the heck we are writing about.
It's true. The thing that amazes me is like so far with Wingless and also with book 2, it's titled is Clanless. There have been parts where I hit like I kind of call it like the thematic hinge scene, where it's like the theme of the story gets very concretely addressed in that scene, and it's usually towards the end. And it's like the character has some sort of epiphany or whatever. And I never plan where these are going to happen. I never know when they're going to happen. They just happen. And I find myself learning things from my own characters that I was like, I didn't know I knew that, or I didn't know that until I wrote it. Like it's kind of interesting how it's like, it just something gets pulled out of your subconscious that obviously you had some feelings about and knew something about, but you'd never maybe thought about it that way before. And then it just kind of comes out and you're like, oh, wow, that was really profound. I didn't know that I just learned something from myself. Or from my characters, right? Like I hadn't thought about this that way before. So I find that I can't make that happen. That just happens.
No.
It just pops up somewhere and you're like, oh, good. I mean, ideally I like my story to have that somewhere, but I can't, like in the first draft of book 2, it didn't really happen, at least not for Asher. But now in the revised version, it does. So I'm like, okay, good. It's there. But anyway, yeah. So that's basically all I have to say at the moment. I'm sure I'll think of other things later.
Well, you can always come back. So because this has been a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, it's been super fun. I like long podcasts. I've been on a couple podcasts before but they've been generally the shorter.
Mm-hmm.
And but I'm like,
I've been on those.
I like listening to the long podcasts myself. The long discussions are fun, and so it's nice to be on one that's a little longer. We can talk about more things.
Yes, and it's not a very scripted podcast, as listeners are very aware. We have a big sort of structure that we just pants it here. We don't plot the podcast,
and that it just flows. It flows in a more natural, conversing kind of way when it's not all structured. So works
I like to
for me.
see where things go, because every I didn't know you before I met you when we started recording.
It's true.
It's a little hard to like plot out a podcast episode because you don't know like what someone's going to want to talk about, what they're passionate about. You can't tell from their web presence sometimes what lights them up. And then you get on there and you get and you get into a really good discussion of, that obscure thing that brings joy to their world, and you have just a fun time hearing about this fascinating thing you didn't know anything about. Like, I love that. I live for that. So
yeah, totally.
I hope listeners like the loose structure.
Yeah.
I'm not capable of doing anything more structured than this.
Yeah. No, I think it works. It's fun, and you're gonna do great at your in-person events because you do this. You have to just like randomly talk to someone for 2 hours that you've never met before. Like,
yeah, I mean, they range in length, the episodes. Like, some of them are shorter, some of them are longer. Like, it all depends on the guest. I hit the same 4 sections in every podcast.
It works. And I bet you every podcast is very different because
yes.
Yep. Everybody you have on is going to be a little different. So
very cool. And I love that. And even repeat guests when they come back. It's the second episode is not like the first one. It's different. We have different conversations. We go different places. It's just a different vibe. And I like that. And you all get to see what it's like for pantsers. Because all of the guests are characters on this podcast, and they take it in all kinds of directions that I never could have anticipated.
Yep. No, it's true. Actually, that's a very good way of putting it.
It's true, though.
Oh my goodness.
So you're definitely invited back. Come back with your next book,
so
and we'll talk more about maybe another area of your world that you've now fleshed out.
Yeah, totally. And maybe by then, I was going to say, by then I might have more ideas about book 3.
Yeah. Or the YA nanny story with Faye. I know Faye are very popular. I've never been a big fan of the Faye, but I know that people, like, readers, like, seem to really love them, and I'm like,
actually
why found them slightly creepy.
I wanted to write this story because I agree with you. I'm not a big fan of the Fae myself. I've always kind of been like, they're kind of sketchy, actually, and so I wanted very dark. I wanted to write a story that was more like, yes, they're popular right now, but my story is not necessarily going to play into popular tropes because the Fae in my story they're not nice people. They're not nice people. So
no, they're not.
They do play into some of the stereotypes. I mean, they can come across as very beautiful and charming, but they're not the good guys. Let's just put it that way.
And when they're not the good guys, like, those books I don't mind because, like, that feels truer to who they were. They're tricksters. So they may do you a good turn because it benefits them in some way, but it's all about what benefits them. It has nothing to do with it benefiting you. It just so happens to do that. You got lucky, you know?
Totally.
Yeah. But we'll come back and talk about that in the future. With you when you've got the story and the world fleshed out, so we can delve into the details. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I had a fantastic time with you this morning.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. This was a blast. So You're definitely love to come back and chat more.
Yes. Definitely welcome to come back to talk about another book, or if you have another topic that you want to talk about. Like, it's open-ended. I'm very open-ended with things.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Should be fun.
Yeah. And thank you, listeners, for listening, and watchers for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, follow all the things so that you will be notified when Catherine Witzaney comes back. I got it this time.
Catherine Witzaney.
Yeah. And I've been your host, Melinda Kucsera, and we talked about Wingless by Catherine Witzaney. And go check it out, and we'll see you next week. Another fantasy author, another fantasy book. Have a great day or great night wherever you are.